Welcome to the Counter Narrative Podcast, a show designed to change the way we talk and think about education. By sharing stories of successes and triumphs, we aim to challenge the dominant narrative that often negatively portrays our disenfranchised populations. I'm your host, Charles Williams, an urban educator for more than 15 years, a current school principal in Chicago, an educational consultant, an equity advocate, and the co-host of Inside the Principal's Office. Let's get started. Hello and welcome back to the Counter Narrative Podcast. So excited that you are joining us again. Now, this is a special episode for a few reasons. One, as you'll notice, I'm not in my usual space. I am at the ASCD conference. So I'm jumping on with a friend here all the way from Cambodia. So super early for me, super late for him. And so then we have my Inside the Principal's Office show, and then I have the conference downstairs. So busy day, but I am excited to have this gentleman back. He and I have had the privilege of connecting, and we tried to do this before, and we did an entire show, and it was an amazing conversation, and something happened to the audio, and it all went. So we're doing it again. And it's not an issue because I love connecting with this guy. Lee, how are you doing today?
I'm great, thank you. Yeah, it's great to be back. It's great to have another conversation with you. I guess we had a dress rehearsal, so let's hope that the live performance is even better this time.
There we go. I like that that mindset. So as I mentioned, briefly as I was just talking about what is going on today, I mentioned that you were in Cambodia. So I don't know if that flew by anybody. So I want to pause and just open it up really quick and allow you to talk a little bit about who you are, what you do, how you ended up in Cambodia, because you don't sound like you're from Cambodia. And maybe just something interesting about yourself. And the plus side is that you could use the one from last time since nobody knows.
Yeah, if I can remember. No, I'm certainly not Khmer. I'm not a Cambodian national. I don't speak Khmer. I can just about tell a tuk-tuk where to go, left and right and straight forward. I'm originally from between two cities in the UK, Sheffield and Nottingham. They're the two main cities where I'm kind of from in the UK. I took the plunge into the international world quite a while back now and moved over to Dubai. I always struggle with that. I am a PE teacher, or I was a PE teacher. I think I always will be a PE teacher, phys ed teacher, but obviously I'm not in the classroom at the moment. I moved into a principal position in Dubai and took over an IB through school in Dubai as the secondary school principal. That was my kind of baptism into the IB world, and I've never looked back. I think it's a wonderful educational philosophy, framework, however you want to look at it. And then I was very fortunate to move across to Cambodia and take on the role at ISPP. Interesting fact, I don't have many interesting facts about me, really. I've led quite a boring life. I guess I made the decision and the mistake of going in the Royal Marines when I was a younger man. I didn't last very long. I did a few months of basic training, then realized, what am I doing? I want to be a teacher. Why am I laying in the bottom of a bush, filthy and wet and cold and tired? So that's my interesting fact, I guess.
All right. Well, thank you. I appreciate it. It's always interesting. Wallace is, we both know Wallace. He's been trying to push me into the international space.
Right.
And it sounds very tempting. I get to see some of these schools. I get to speak to some of these people. And it sounds amazing. And then I think well, my baby, she's 18. So it's like she's about to go off to college. In fact, we're taking her to go see her school next month.
Nice.
But we, my wife and I, we have 5 daughters. The oldest one has given us a grandson. So it's like, do we really want to move halfway around the world? We've talked about kidnapping him and just taking him with us. He'll get an international education.
Yeah. No, I feel that pain. It certainly is it's a big decision to make. I do feel that I was very fortunate to marry the lady that I married. She's very open-minded, adventurous, and kind of, we literally threw caution to the wind. We'd never even been to Dubai when we moved there. We'd never really been to Cambodia when we moved here. So it really is, your mindset changes when you move into the international setting. I do feel one of the things that I feel incredibly fortunate having moved into the international setting is my mindset has changed so much. I think when you talk about being open-minded, there's only so much, it's only so far you can go with that if you're from the town that I'm from, because you're not exposed to different cultures, different languages, different religions, even, dare I even say it, different perspectives. Everyone's raised roughly in the same way, having experienced the same sort of schooling system and the same regional ethics and morals and things like that. So you really you don't get, even if you're the most open-minded person, if you live in quite a homogenous area, you don't get that kind of open-mindedness. I feel so fortunate. I've worked with children and families from all different religious backgrounds, different language profiles, different nationalities. And I've learned so much from every family that I've been involved in, right from the way that I have to behave with them if I'm dealing with a sensitive topic, to the ways in which things are celebrated, the language use, the perspectives on things. It's just been amazing, and I really would recommend it for anyone if they have the ability to cut ties from their friends and families and spend months at a time without seeing anyone. So I feel your pain with the grandchildren thing. It's nasty being cut off from your family for sure.
Yeah, yeah. Well, not that didn't make it any easier. No, it sounds amazing. It sounds amazing. But it makes me think about kind of the conversation we had last time, and I know you were kind of talking about the vast differences within the schools, and yet many of the same similarities. That people may deal with, like here in the States or in other countries. And so I'm curious if we can jump into something that you have seen, how have you or what have you seen that kind of challenges that narrative that people may have a misconception about within education?
That's a tricky one, I guess. Do you mean as in something that I've experienced that kind of caught me out a little bit, or do you mean positively or negatively, or what do you mean?
Yeah, I think either or. I know last time when we connected, you had talked a little bit about, despite all of the vast differences within the schools, you also talked about how still there are, there are still some of those like racial issues, and how,
Yeah, yeah,
um, there's perceptions about what things are like, but here's the reality, and this is how we're dealing with those realities.
yeah. I mean, when I completed my masters, there was a unit on I forget what the unit was about now, but there was a topic within that talked about microaggressions. And one of the things that came up in that reading was that, like, one of the worst things that you can say is that I don't see color. I don't see color, and because that's like you're neglecting the fact that there's difference, and it's not about pretending that there's no difference, it's about recognizing the difference. And I found that really challenging for me, because I think said to you last time, when I grew up, the school that I went to, there was one young black man in my school. He was a year or two above me. There was one Pakistani family in the school. They had multiple kids in different grade levels to me, and everyone else was white. So for me, I never associated the rich kids with one language or one particular way of looking or one particular skin color, or the naughty kids or the academically able kids, or the kids good at math, the kid good at science, the kid that's good at PE. I never did that, because the naughty kids were white, the good kids were white, the rich kids were white, the poor kids were white. So I never had that kind of that subconscious connection to kids that are predominantly from this neighborhood happen to be this color, and that's a poor neighborhood, or kids that look like this happen to have a certain cultural way in which their family approach the importance of mathematics, and therefore they end up having quite a mathematical mind. So I never had any of that. It was always there was none of it. And then when I came away to go into an international school, I started to experience some of that. I got a little bit of it at university because I moved to a major city, so there was a little bit of it there. But I think I was so caught up in my own studies and living the university life that I probably didn't see it as much. But moving into an international school, I did start to see it. And I started to hear things about being careful how many people from a certain ethnic background we hire, because of the potential image that might portray.
Mm.
or hearing other people saying things like that. We have to be cautious of how many people at our school. We have to be cautious of this. And I never really thought about that at my school. I interviewed people. If I liked that person, if I vibed with that person, if I thought they fit with my community, and they would bring something that would strengthen my community, I'd hire them. I never thought, oh, that's the third Filipino person we've hired into our science department. We need to be careful there because that might start to give some sort of perception. But then it really struck home to me. We hired a lady from the States, and she was a person of color, and she sat in her first teacher conferences with a family, and I won't mention nationality or anything like that, but she sat with a family, and she came and reported it to me because I ended up having to address this, and she came and reported to me and said they asked me where I was from, and I very casually said, I'm from the States. Do you mean, am I from America, or do you mean the state that I'm from? I'm from Atlanta, if that's what you mean. And they said, no, where are you really from? And she said, and she shared that she'd had a similar background to me, where she'd grown up with white kids and she was the only black kid. And therefore, but she'd never felt like that she was different. She'd never been made to feel that way. And I would hate, I can't empathize, because if I can empathize, I've walked in her shoes and I haven't. I could sympathize with how she was feeling, but I was caught out by the fact that she wasn't upset, she wasn't angry, I didn't, the emotions that it triggered in her were really strange for me. She seemed, the only word I can think is confused. She was confused that this person would be so open to say, no, where are you really from? And she didn't know how to respond. So I went and spoke to the head of school at the time, and said that this is something that's happened. The family were quite known to us because they were a bit of a tricky character. And the head teacher, to his credit, said, when you meet with that family, tell them that they can have their deposit back and they can leave the school, unless, if that's the kind of the approach that they're going to have, that's the mentality that they have. Explain to them that we hire the best teachers that we can find, and blah 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 blah. And we went through all that, and fortunately, the family kind of realized the error of their ways, and I won't go into the details of the conversation, but they ended up having quite a good relationship with that teacher, and hopefully that was something that helped them to be better, better people. But I was caught out by that kind of comment that was made. The other thing that I experienced for the first time when I moved internationally was banners outside schools saying all our teachers are hired from Britain, like all British teachers, because it's apparently only British teachers can teach the British curriculum. But that for me is a strange kind of kite mark of quality, is that our teachers are British. Like that's some sort of kind of mark standard of quality. Now, the school I work in now, I've got teachers from the Netherlands, I've got teachers from different African countries, I've got teachers from the Philippines, I've got teachers from the States, and I wouldn't say that any one of them are better than the other based on the country that they're from. So to have that as a banner outside of school just seems odd to me. So yeah, there's some of the watershed moments that I've had. There's some of the more memorable ones, or infamous ones.
Well, thank you. I'm wondering if I could dive into this, the idea of the colorblindness a little bit,
Yeah, okay.
because you bring up an interesting perspective. I think, at least like here, in the States, we're extremely, in most places, we're extremely diverse, right? I mean, you tend to see people that look different from you, depending on where you live within the States, but it's just a common thing. But I remember the first time I traveled overseas, really overseas, I went to China, and I stuck out, right? I was like, there's nobody else in this space that looks anything like me. And it was vastly different. So I kind of understood some people to say, hey, I grew up not knowing anything
Yeah.
else. And so it's easy to kind of just put up these blinders, strip those things away, because it made sense in my community. If we all look the same, if we're all kind of growing up with the same mentality, then it's okay for me to have those blinders up and to say, well, we're not going to recognize this and that. But in the reality of the world, right, when you're in around most people, when you strip that away, and I talk about this in one of my sessions, you're saying that I don't recognize what you're bringing to the table, those unique characteristics and qualities, of your race and your culture, right, that you're bringing into the space. And so I'm just curious a little bit, if you were to tell somebody, right, like if somebody was in that position making that mindset shift, what would be some of the reasons or rationales or tips or strategies, I guess, to say, hey, you know what? Yeah, I came from this very homogenous area, don't really know anything else, into this area that's extremely diverse. What are some things that I could do so that way I don't keep those blinders up
Mm.
and run into some of those
Mm.
problems?
First of all, I'd be careful to say anything because I'm certainly not a pro at this. And I when we were meeting with our students the other week, a certain committee that I may come back to later if the opportunity arises, where I said to them, I don't know how to do this. You're going to need to help me with this. And I think there's a very, I mean, I've asked the question myself. So I hired a guy a few years ago, and he again was a person of color, and he explained to me that his father was from Sri Lanka, and he said he was half Sri Lankan, half Irish. So I said, oh, cool. Which side of your family is Sri Lankan? Is it mom or dad? And I sensed a little bit of heat straight away, and he kind of said, why do you ask that? And that in that moment, that could have been a moment that kind of really escalated the conversation, where I could have responded with, why are you so offended by an innocent question? Like, I'm only asking you a question, dude. And I could have got all prickly. But I think you've just got a sense, and this is the nuance of microaggressions, isn't it? It's a small thing once is not a problem, but when that person's facing that small thing 100 times a day, it's a problem. It causes problems, and it was obviously something that he had negative experiences around. And I said to him, my response was, I'm just really interested to find out about your story. And that disarmed him straight away and just went, oh, okay, it's actually my father. And I was like, oh, cool. What's his story? And I was just genuinely interested in him as a person, trying to
Sure,
find out
sure.
about him. And I ended up finding some really cool things out about his father. He told me really kind of really unique stories about his dad arriving in Great Britain, in England, actually. His mum had arrived from Ireland at the same time in England. And this really lovely story of how they met, how they had nothing, and how they'd grown and become this really successful family, how he had obviously gone on to become successful. And I think it was that genuine inquisitive nature that I had, and then recognizing the signs that I'm treading on thin ice here, and I have to be really careful about the language that I'm using. And I think we have to be really sensitive to the way that we respond. I had a conversation with a friend the other day, actually, that was talking about, he's in China at the moment, stuck in China, and he talked about racism in China and how white people or Westerners are now being treated as kind of the carrier of COVID. The only cases that are coming in. So they're facing all this racism. And I almost wanted to say, dude, cry me a river. You're a white guy that's probably enjoyed a lot of privilege for a long time. So you're getting a bit of a hard time at the minute. Yeah, okay, let's kind of walk in those shoes for a while.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned the gentleman that you interacted with, because I've had the same question. I'm half black, half white, and people have always asked, well, who's black? And I never really thought about it when I was younger. I was always like my dad.
Mm.
But as I got older and I started realizing, like, those mean two vastly different things. Like, when I'm imagining a black man or a black woman, it's like, oh, your dad was white. Okay. It's like, oh, but your dad's black. Like,
Okay.
and it brings this whole different connotation with it. And it is that kind of same question. Like, why are you asking? Like, are
Yeah.
you asking like yourself? Is it coming from a place of genuine just interest because you're trying to get to know me, because you're trying to drop those blinders and build relationships and connections? Or are you doing it because you have your own biases and you're trying to figure out, where do I stand with you?
Yeah.
So yeah, it's
Do you feel
interesting.
that there's a difference between saying, so you actually identified that there as saying, I'm half black, half white. If you'd have said, I'm half Jamaican, half Norwegian, I feel that there's more of a story there. But to say I'm half black, half white, I kind of wonder, why does that matter? Why would that question be asked? So which half of your family is black? I think if there was a story behind it that could create that inquisition, then I kind of understand it. But I wonder if there's any difference. Do you feel that that's any difference?
So, when I was younger, I didn't. But
Okay.
as I got older, I started, it was, we want to know who's black because there's a, there's a difference of saying, well, your father was black. So now we're imagining it's a black man in the
Right.
picture. So when you're like, oh, it's a black man in the picture, was he present? Was he not present? Whereas
Oh,
it's like if your
okay.
mom was black, there's no question, right?
Okay.
We know mom's there. Oh, dad was white. Like we're just assuming that it was, I forgot the name of it, that family. But it's like, oh yeah, everything was okay, but oh, your dad was black. Was he in the picture? Like, wait a minute. So it leads down these two completely
Oh, I
different
see.
pathways. And as I got older, I was like, that's really no, like it shouldn't matter
Yeah, yeah.
who is who. But I started realizing, that led to a whole set of kind of perceptions now that you have of me. Like, oh, so if your father was black, this is how you probably grew up versus, and it's unfortunate. Again, I think that's a reflection of many of the deep seated and ingrained, the history
Hmm.
even here in this country. Um, but it's important, I think, like you said earlier, like as educators, as we have students coming into our spaces from diverse backgrounds, not to be cognizant, right? To be cognizant of our own biases, so we're not contributing, to those microaggressions. Because you're right, it may be small, it
Hmm.
may seem insignificant. Like I was reading something that said, imagine a microaggression of somebody just, one person walking by and punching you in the arm, no big deal. But
Yeah,
now imagine you're walking down the street and 20 people are walking down and each one is punching you in the
yeah,
arm. Like
yeah,
your arms, like
yeah,
like it adds up. And so, yeah, definitely being cognizant of where you stand so you're not contributing to that.
yeah. And it's tricky, right? I mean, it's one of those things where instantly there you telling me your perspective, because I genuinely I hope I wouldn't ask that question if someone said, um, I mean, it would only be black white. I'm half black, half white. I genuinely hope I wouldn't follow up with which half of your family is black, because that's not something I'm inquisitive about. But even in that situation, I would never have thought that that's the perspective that you would take from that. That's the way that that would come across to you, and that's potentially, I mean, if we're being honest about the way in which we approach this, potentially that is my subconscious or my unconscious. That's where my mind's gone to when I ask that question, but I would never have taken that perspective. So it's really interesting to hear you talk like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a journey, and I've talked about this a lot. Just kind of my own journey and discovering and realizing, my background when I was younger. Right, my grandfather, he raised me, my mother's father, and he was from Ireland. And so he saw, some many of the atrocities that were occurring in this country for people of color, especially men of color. And in his attempt to say, I'm going to try to help you, he stripped that away. He implemented, an extreme version of color blindness to
Mm,
say, we're not going to recognize those things.
mm.
So I grew up for a long time not recognizing that I was a person of color, which you're like, how do you? It's like I'm just really tan, I guess. I don't know. But as I got older, I started like exploring that and like launching into it, and I'm like, oh, and that's when a lot of these things made sense, and reflecting, there were a lot of microaggressions growing up, but I never even realized them. I have in my yearbook, one of my friends wrote, you're my favorite darkie. And again, just me being completely naive, it was like, oh, haha. And I look at it now and I'm like, how was I so ignorant?
Yeah,
But that was my experience. And again, I think that's, we started off kind of talking about color blindness. That's one of those things when you strip it away, and you don't have the tools or the cultural capital to navigate spaces. It's like it could become a very dangerous place for you to be, because I was just sitting there naive to all of the things that were happening around me. And while it helped because I wasn't getting hurt because I didn't know,
yeah,
it didn't change the reality of the situation. Right.
yeah.
And as I got older, it's like, okay, like maybe you weren't really my friend. Like, or maybe you were and you just had your own bias and growing up, and You were just doing what you thought was okay as well. I don't know. It becomes very complex.
And that's one thing that I think, like you say, we as educators, we have to do a better job
Mhm.
of teaching young people how to approach those conversations, without aggression, without fighting fire with fire. That's my perspective, I guess. Is that it's kind of go, hey, hang on a minute, because do you understand that what you've just said? Like, let me just say back to you what you've just said to me, or let me read this to you so you can hear it said. And this again, what you shared with me today. Let me share with you my perspective when you say that to me or say that about me. And I think that's one of the biggest responsibilities that we have with young people is providing them with the tools to advocate for themselves and others. So hang on a minute, you shouldn't be talking about him in that way. He's not here, so I'm going to advocate for him, and empowering those young people to be able to have those conversations, in a well-informed and but powerful way, right? I think that's a big responsibility for us.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. It's advocacy is one of the three A's that I say are like the equitable tenets of education. And I think it's also important, just as we're talking about this, we're in my school is very homogenous, very much, I think, like in a very situation that you grew up, but we are all African American. So my students, they live in a community that's predominantly African American. The school is predominantly African American. So the other day, for example, a young lady came up to me and asked if I was married, and then she said, well, like when I mentioned that my wife was Mexican, she was like appalled. So why are you upset about that? She's like, well, they're loud and they're rude and they're this and they're that. And I said, honey, like, why are you saying, well, that's what my mom says. Right. And so like, here you are, she's in second grade. You already have this idea about
Yeah.
another group of people. And it stems from, I think, in large part because you don't interact with anybody from from this other group. Um, so we started having conversations around that. But, I also think that it goes beyond just, race, because I think a lot of times, again, in those homogenous groups, like we're starting to see this about, we start talking about like gender identities or sexual orientations. And it's a really tough conversation to have because people are like, we don't do that. Like it exists. Just like I know we talk about color blindness, but this is another type of blindness. Just because you ignore it doesn't mean it no longer exists.
Yeah, for sure. I do feel that's, whilst I'm not saying that, race is not something that we have to consider at our school. I think there are greater areas of bias and challenge that we face. I mean, the socioeconomic differences is a greater area where, I guess, when I consider it in that way, not that necessarily groups are attacked or singled out for being one way or the other, but it's the way in which you see students kind of coexist, and the kind of the really rich kids are coexisting together and not part of a collective as much. And then the students that we have at our school that are on the other end of that spectrum kind of coexist together. So whilst there may not be any kind of friction between them, there certainly is those groupings that come together. But one of the things that, our student union are looking at the moment, it was their priority number one when we put our union together, and then our student life committee came off of that. Their priority number one was about the use of pronouns in school. And the reason why that became their priority number one is because inclusive is mentioned in our guiding statements of our school. So we'd said about one of the things that we want you to really focus on is how we can make our environment as inclusive as possible. They said if that's the case, if our one of our number one priorities is that, then we have to make the students in our school that do not feel, like they are being included in the conversation because they don't identify as he, him, she, her. We need to address that. And I've been blown away by the way in which they've approached things. And the epitome of it for me was I was sat on the lawns having a conversation with them a few weeks ago. We talked about teacher perspective and how they were talking first of all about how do we give these students the permission and the authority and the place to be able to identify to us that they are non-cis male, non-cis female, and they want to be identified as they, them. And when we started talking about the teacher involvement, their response was, well, let's hear their voice. Let's invite the teachers to a conversation and let's hear their voice. And I thought that was so powerful that they didn't say, well, let's put something together to share with teachers and tell them what we want to do. It was these young people, these 15, 16, 17-year-old people had said, let's bring them into the conversation and let's hear their voice before we take action. And I thought that who's teaching who here? I'm trying to guide this conversation the right way, and you guys don't need me here. It's just like you can do this on your own. I learned a lot in that moment with that group. That it's just about hearing people and then kind of getting to grips with where they're coming from. Then we can move forward with helping them to understand our perspective, and that's kind of their approach on it, which I thought was really nice and really forward thinking on their part.
Well, you bring up a great point with our students, right? We talk about student voice, choice, agency, and the reality is, I think, in many times, these things are just normal for our students, right? They're growing up with this, so like the concepts of like different pronouns or they're like, yeah, like it's just part of who they are. The reality is it's us, right? Mm-hmm. It's the adults who are uncomfortable, who don't understand, and we're so accustomed to creating systems and processes that make us comfortable. So we know how to operate within them because it allows us to have the power dynamic, right? So it's very scary to take that step back and say, kids, like, can you run with this? But like, isn't that what we as educators are supposed to do, right? We're supposed to give students the tools and the skills, empower them, and step back and let them grow and flourish. But oftentimes that means that we have to be uncomfortable. We may be operating in a space of unknown, and it's like, but that's okay. That is okay.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the most uncomfortable thing for educators, effective, high quality, caring, like educators that have the right mindset, is that fear of failure for the young people. Educators very often are so scared of the young people making mistakes, something not working for them, that they over scaffold things, they over support with things. And it's just about prepare the students, because I've had conversations again with groups of students where I've said, listen, you're putting a lot of work into this and it might not work. So let's just be ready for that. If it falls flat on its face, then let's be ready to dust ourselves off and start again and reevaluate and go again. So I always try to preface that with young people that are working on anything. I always say to them, this might not work. So just be ready for it not to work. So that's why it's really important that you plan properly and you keep the information from your planning so that you've got that and that you can look back over that and you can kind of go, oh, maybe this is where we missed out. We didn't inform the director that we were going to try and do this. So maybe next time we bring the director in a little earlier. But yeah, just allowing them to fail and giving them that freedom to fail, but then being there to pick them back up. That's when we become so critical as educators, is not when the students are succeeding or when they're on the way to success. It's actually when they trip and fall, and we have to be the people to pick them up, dust them off and get the momentum back for them. And that's the bit that I kind of enjoy with these sorts of things. But they're certainly leading the way for me at the moment with the pronoun work, that's for sure.
Well, Lee, as always, wonderful. It's been a wonderful conversation. I look up and I'm always amazed, like this time just flies by while we're having these great conversations. So as we get ready to wrap up here, I am sure there are educators who, they want to connect with you. Not whether it's just to say, I know somebody in Cambodia, or whether it's, to say, I really want to pull from the wisdom that Lee has, or maybe they're looking for an international job, who knows? But how can they find you? How can they connect with you?
Well, I've got quite a distinct name, so there's not many of me out there. So Twitter, I'm on Twitter. I try to use Twitter as much as I can because I find that I connect with some wonderful people on there. So you can find me on there. LinkedIn, as most educators are now, and I do have a website that I've not kept as up to date as I should have done over the last few months, called wholeineducation.com. So you can see some of my musings and some of my my thoughts have been spilled out onto the webpage there. So I'm happy to connect with anyone and carry on any conversations that I've had on here.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I'll make sure that I include all of that in the show notes so that you, the listeners, are able to connect. Lee, I want to just say thank you for, being on the show, of course, but again, all of the amazing work that you're doing. I hope at some point, maybe I get to come and pay you guys a visit and see
That'd
your
be
school
amazing.
in person.
Yeah, that'd be amazing.
So I just want to say thank you, thank you, thank you. It's been a pleasure as always, and I cannot wait to connect with you again.
Thank you. The pleasure's all mine.